I love NextJS, but I don't love everything about it. GetServerSideProps was a revolution at the time. You write a function, you do some backend stuff in it, and now your component in the same file has that data. At a page level, that was groundbreakingly cool. It made metadata way easier, good SEO possible, and it revolutionized how we think about our React code. Sadly, these patterns have not aged well, especially when you look at better solutions like what Remix is doing, what SolidStart is doing, what TRPC enables. Server-side prop functions in NextJS as they currently work are a little unpleasant and require you to deeply understand the flow of data in your application before you can use them meaningfully. Let's talk a bit about that and why I think it's a problem. So, getServerSideProps sucks. I want to break this down into a few reasons why. I think I can break these down into 3-ish categories. I'll say 1, type safety. 2, routing. 3, data flows. These 3 areas are areas in which getServerSideProps is incredibly weak. The first one, simple enough. The types are not correct. If we go to, let's init an app and show it actually. Why not? We will do it. Make a new stream, npx create next app at latest. GSSP. And it uses yarn by default, even though I used npm. Come on, guys. We fix this in create T3 app. You have no excuse. Guys, I don't hate yarn, but I didn't pick yarn. I certainly didn't pick yarn v1. I picked npm when I typed npx, and they changed my mind for me. So we're going to rm rf yarn.lock, rm rf node modules, and then we're going to npm install it because that's what I picked. I shouldn't have to -- use npm. It should use the thing I use to init. I can yarn create if I want yarn. I can npm if I want npm. Or npx if I want npm, and pnpx if I want pnpm. Just tired of these things making the decisions for me and making the wrong ones when they do. Cool. Now we have an index.txx. After all that, we now have this. So they don't do semicolons by default? Are you kidding? Well, my default lint rules will fix that pretty fast. What's it mad about? Cannot find name meta? I hate this template. I hate this template. Anyways, use create T3 app. Don't use create next app. Like, seriously, don't. It's not in a state where it's usable anymore. It's sad. It's genuinely sad. Just use what we built. It works, and this doesn't. That all said, let's build. We want to get data into this page. Let's say we have something from the database we want, the number of users who have been to this page. We want to fetch that from the database and render that on the page. We need a server-side props function. Export const get server-side props equals async return props count 5. Cool. Now we're returning this. This will now be in the props here. So if I props console.log props, this will be here. npm run dev. If I don't have anything else running, I don't. Local host 3000, go into the console, and we will see props has count 5 on it. How did that get there? Well, we returned it here, and it goes through a couple layers, and then it pops out in here. Sadly, it's actually possible to break that. If I go and I delete this here, and I reload this, we get nothing. Or if I, and this is actually a pretty common one, I have a if type of window is undefined or something like that. That might not be the best example in here. Let's say let auth equal false. And I can have if not auth, we return component, but we have auth equals false here so that we can pass this down. Now, if I go here, we'll see auth false comes through, but we're losing the page props. The thing that we fetched here in this file in getServerSideProps isn't making it to our component because of the order of events in getServerSideProps. So this is kind of the data flow point. So I'm gonna, like the data flow is part of why the type safety is bad. I'm gonna reorder these for that reason. Routing and conditional data. So the data flows are rough. The first thing we have is getServerSideProps, which gets called, resolves some data, does whatever it needs to do. And then it gets passed this nice small arrow to app.tsx. And this guy runs and decides what to do with those props from there. And then, and only then, it might, I'm going to use the dotted line as a conditional, it might make it to the current page.tsx. I'll name it page.tsx, make it a little easier. But you might not even make it to the page file with the things you fetch. So if we want to, and this is pretty common too, let's try to get some types on here. We want to pass props here. Type of infer get. It's not going to autocomplete. Infer get. Nope. Infer get server side props. NextJS. Infer. That is really weird way of doing that. Cool. So now this thinks count exists. So let's console log props.count because this thinks it exists. We'll say props.count dot toString. Sure, so you can run toString on that. Oh, wait, we're getting an error because this is lying to us. And it's very easy to tell lies due to the data flow. Buddy, do you have to loudly scratch things right now? Yeah. So if you do what they say, which is infer the types off of that, it used to do some weird inference shit where it would optional all the types, which it no longer does, which is nice. But here it's still pretty unintuitive in that it thinks this exists, but if your app does something else, it's broken. And if you ever forget to page props drill here, you're screwed. Camera's out of focus. There we go. Yeah. So the data flow here is not deterministic. This being here does not mean this ends up here. It should, and in most cases it will, but this is not a proper contract in terms of the flow of data. The flow is, trying to find the right words for it. It's inconsistent. I want to talk a bit more about part 3, though. I think I've touched a decent bit on type safety being not great and the data flows not being great. Oh, there's one more type safety thing I should touch on, which is things that don't serialize properly. Let's do rendered at new date. So we're going to pass a new date down. And if we look here, props.date does, oh, it's a rendered at is what I named it. Rendered at. And let's do .getDate on this because we're getting a date back. Oh, that errors too. Because we can't serialize a date object through getServerSideProps or getStaticProps or any of the other server-side property or functions in Next because it is dumping a JSON blob into the page when it does this. and that JSON blob can only serialize JSON things. And it's unintuitive here. We don't get an error or anything that getServerSideProps can't return things that aren't JSON serializable. So as far as our type system is concerned, everything here is A-OK, but it breaks in actual build. That scares me, and I try to avoid any technologies that allow these types of things as the default. Somebody asked if you can super JSON with GSSP. You cannot if you're using SWC. My cats are going insane. 1 second. Cats have been extra feisty today. Someone asked about the remix loaders. The remix loaders, if you're using types like the ones that Maple created, will error if you try to return JSON or something that isn't JSON serializable inside of the loader function itself, which is really nice. So there are frameworks where there are solutions that solve these things somewhat elegantly even. Next is not one of them. Remix has its own type safety problems we can go into another time, but yeah, type safety, this isn't doing great. Data flows are unintuitive too, because this has to go through document, then to get server-side props, then to the app file, then to your page file. That's pretty unintuitive. And I wanted to specifically call that out because I think it's important you understand it. I'm also realizing there's a fourth thing that I need to add here, which is just perf in general. But yeah. Number 3 is the routing and conditional data. Let's say on this page, we have auth. So we know this will also have auth because we're adding that above where auth is true or false. So I'll just hack this in because we've already concluded this is not type safe, but we should have auth on this generally. I'll add this here. Auth true. Otherwise, yeah, that's all fine. Cool. So now we will have auth. We only know that because I hacked this in here, which is annoying, but fine, whatever. The hierarchy's bad. We understand. Let's say we want to use auth state to render or not render a certain page. Like if props.auth return const auth only page. So you have this page, you're only supposed to get if it's auth. Well, auth only page is what we return here instead. I did wrong type of bracket there because I'm dumb. Cool. So if you're auth, we return this page. Otherwise, you return that. And let's say if you're auth, we want to fetch different data. Because if you're auth, we want to do something else. Let's say once this is checked auth, God, no, because this is where next really breaks down. We want to check for auth, and based on that, we want to fetch additional data. There isn't a way to do this with getServerSideProps without fundamentally raising where this is happening. So right now we're applying auth here. We'd have to apply this somewhere else. So what we'll do is put it in page props now, props.auth, which it doesn't know exists. So we'll do this. Page props is empty object. So page props as any .auth. And that's going to be passed through anyways. Doesn't matter though. We're intentionally showing what messy looks like. Well, const get auth equals return math.random greater than 0.5. So it's random each time. And we want to return an auth state from here. Now this gets passed through to this page, conditions are hit, and then that gets passed down further here. But let's say this needs additional data. So this react.fc, this component requires not just count, but maybe it also requires username. String. Props. And we say, hi, props.username. How do we get the username to here? Well, first we're getting a type error there. So over here, we're going to get a username, but only if you're auth. So const auth equals get auth. If auth, return props Put auth in there as is. Otherwise, we return whatever else. I also just realized we're not naming that correctly. We're doing auth, which is dumb, but fine. Cool. So now, if auth is true, props auth gets passed through username test. I could even be much more strict with this. So auth colon true, and here auth colon false. So that we know we either get this with the count and rendered at, or we get this with username. If props.auth, theoretically, we now know username equals props.username. But we're getting a type error here because it doesn't necessarily know that if props.auth is true, this is good. So put an exclamation point in there to enforce that. You're starting to see, oh, props.auth versus auth. That's fair. I think I can just delete this, though. Delete that. Nope, still, if props.auth, username props.username. Still incorrect. Fixing that way. Yeah. That sucks. This flow is bad. That if this component needs this data, first off, that this component needs to know about that and manage that. More importantly, that all of the data this whole page needs has to be fetched here. So let's say this component was 6 components deep in another file somewhere, and it needs this data. We put this prop on it, we go up a layer, we put the prop on it, we go up a layer, we put the prop on it, we go up a layer. And then in the server functions, for all the pages that render it at, we now have to remember to go add that to get server-side props, because this is the top of the funnel. This is where all of the data for that first pass has to come through. And if we don't have any of the data that any of our components need when this happens, then we can't use the server functions for that component's data. We have to fetch it somewhere else. That requirement means that the data flow here is very top down. It requires you to know everything the page might need before you even start rendering it, because you need all of that data and a type contract to bring that data all the way through ahead. People are saying, why not context? Because components are used in multiple pages, and you're not going to build a whole data architecture around every possible route condition in a context to build into get server-side props with it. If you have done that, fantastic. Don't call me during your outages when you forgot certain data on certain routes and everything falls to shit. Adding additional layers of abstraction doesn't make this better. It makes it more likely to break. A component that knows what data it needs, or a route that knows what data it needs, should be able to fetch that data, ideally in one pass. With Create T3 app, we're using tRPC, which means we're not server-side rendering all of the data on the page. We render a minimal subset, usually just like a static HTML file. And then, based on which components render, a batch data request is made to fill that page with the correct data at a component level. Different routes and different components need different data, so they request it in different ways, and the page renders correctly. There is an additional step in waterfall there, but the DX is unbeatable. There is a future where the DX here can get to that point. I look at solid start with longing eyes, the ability to write a get data function and then just call that, and it will be handled correctly. Next SWR is getting pretty close as well. The next SWR endpoints is getting pretty far with these flows as well. And I'm very excited for ways to import at a component level the data you need from your backend, rather than implicitly adding all of the data you need here and hoping that every component that needs data is getting the data they need from this function. That like the amount you have to understand of your data flow, where it's like after page.tsx, this is unknown number of components, and then here component that needs data, component tsx. If you put another wrapper here of a context, you're adding an additional stopping point. My problem is how many steps are here in the first place. If you can reduce these, you'll make working with your application significantly easier as a developer. But let's go into this fourth one I added last second, performance in general. I generally think that blocking first byte on a data request is bad if you can avoid it. Having HTML on the user's device as fast as possible is something I like to strive for. I have a few talks where I've went in depth on this. I'll link them in the description of the video, where I talk about React data flows and rendering patterns. And the harsh reality with getServerSideProps is it blocks for way too long. Let me see if I can find one of these diagrams fast, because I have so many of them, and some of them are actually really good. It's probably in this one from before I was moving things properly. This it? Yep. Cool. So with NextSSR, you block up until all of that data fetches, and the user sees a blank page that whole time. It is a white render on their device because there's nothing there yet. And when the HTML comes in, there's no pop-in, but they don't see anything until then. That behavior kind of sucks. And on websites that block on server, you can feel it, especially if you're using Prisma. It can take like 3 seconds for a page to load. It's rough. If you had a cache layer in front, cool, but now you're breaking the auth use case and yada, yada. There are a lot of catches when you block all HTML returning to the user on a server-side data request. That is a huge hit to take, and it means that when you write these getServerSideProps functions, you need to go out of your way to make sure they resolve as fast as possible, or you're going to be blocking all of the page or all of the contents of the user's experience on that. Add a bunch of caching in front and you can make it work, but that's like an additional expectation of the developer implementing with getServerSideProps. You'll notice a theme here. Because of the assumptions that the getServerSideProps primitive makes in Next, you have to work around a lot of edges. You can do it. There are lots of ways to make getServerSideProps work and work okay, but those have a lot of effort required with them, and you need to understand it very well to build performant experiences on top. And even then, if you get everything right, it still can take up to 3 seconds for a cold start if you're using like a heavy Prisma implementation. And you have a lot of code in that Lambda that has to spin up. So you're blocking first byte significantly longer than you have to. You are architecting type chains and data flows around a weird pattern that doesn't understand that components can need data and that pages are the wrong place to do it. Sharing the definitions and importing those is a whole like cluster. Yeah, it's not great. And the routing problems of like, let's say we had a nested route. So /users or /dashboard/users. /dashboard has a getServerSideProps, /dashboard/user has getServerSideProps. It's rough. A lot of these things will likely be solved with the new NextJS RFC. Everything I've seen so far, both what's public and what's not, is incredibly promising that it's going to fix these problems. But in its current state, getServerSideProps feels less like a feature that you should be excited about and more like an anti-pattern that you should avoid if you can. It was an incredible revolution at the time, but as it currently stands, getServerSideProps is rough, and you should probably avoid it if you can. Hope this was a useful rant. I've been holding this one in for a while. I've talked about this topic in a few other videos. If you agree or disagree or have additional questions, feel free to ask them in the comments, or even better, join the Discord at t3.gg/discord. Really appreciate all of you for hanging out for this one. Thank you guys again. Peace, nerds.